Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we're reading the book entitled Pioneers Together by Josephine Cunnington Edwards. This book is a biography of Roy F. Cottrell and his wife Myrtie, who were both born in 1878 and led an exciting life of service and mission in the early days of the young and rapidly growing Seventh-day Adventist Church. In our last reading, we covered chapters 8 and 9, and we looked at the early years of Roy and Myrtie's married life, where Roy's career, with Myrtie always at his side, blossomed. He was preaching every Sabbath, conducting evangelistic meetings on Sunday nights, and maturing in his service to the Lord. At the end of their first summer together, he was invited to join South Lancaster Academy, now known as Atlantic Union College, as Dean of Men and Assistant Bible Teacher. They spent many years at that institution, where Roy achieved great success and learned many lessons of humility. While there, he was appointed head of the Bible department. He and Myrtie were also invited to attend the 1905 General Conference session as delegates, where they again met many pioneers of the Adventist Church and were privileged to listen to Ellen White speak at that auspicious event. During their tenure at South Lancaster, Roy was also invited to participate as a delegate to the General Conference Educational Convention. Shortly after this, the Great San Francisco earthquake occurred on April 18, 1906, and soon after that, on their way to the convention, they passed through Battle Creek, where the unfortunate controversy between Dr. J.H. Kellogg and the church leaders was now raging. Here, they again met Elder A.G. Daniels, who accompanied them and many other delegates on the train ride to the convention. He became good friends with the Cottrells, and the following year, at camp meeting in Elizabeth, New Jersey, he unexpectedly asked Roy to deliver the opening prayer. He had good reason to bypass many conference officials and seasoned ministers to ask Roy, because after his sermon, he informed Roy and Myrtie of the decision made at a council meeting in Switzerland that they had been appointed to mission service in China. Shortly after this, Roy attended the youth convention in Mount Vernon, Ohio, where he was appointed secretary to the committee which formed and named the Missionary Volunteer Department of the General Conference, and laid the groundwork for organizing the vast army of Seventh-day Adventist youth. On returning to South Lancaster, he made preparation for leaving to China. After they had packed their belongings for shipping to the Far East, and sold what they couldn't pack, and closed their home, and purchased tickets for their trip to Shanghai, it turned out that the school could not find a replacement for Roy to head their Bible department. While the search went on, Roy and Myrtie stayed with Elder and Mrs. Farnsworth, those well-known Adventist missionaries who had worked closely with Ellen White in Australia, establishing the Adventist Church in that continent. Finally, on January 3rd, 1908, after a very distinguished farewell celebration at South Lancaster, Roy and Myrtie set off on their cross-country trip to California to embark on their journey to China to begin a life of mission service. We pick up the story now in chapter 10, entitled En Route to the Far East. To guard against theft or loss, Roy and Myrtie were carrying most of their money in the form of several New York bank drafts. But they ran into trouble even before leaving America. Since they were to sail from the West Coast, they first took the train for Chicago. But to their surprise and dismay, they learned that because of a sudden financial crisis in the country, the New York bank drafts were not negotiable in the Windy City. This left them financially embarrassed. But thanks to the close ties of our denominational work, Dr. David Paulson's sanitarium, then located on 32nd Place, proved to be even better than a fine hotel. They had planned a side trip into South Dakota to visit with relatives before beginning their long journey overseas. But since they could not cash their bank drafts, they had insufficient currency to buy railroad tickets. The sanitarium folk, however, rescued them from their predicament by supplying them with the necessary funds. Since both Roy and Myrtie had been reared in a part of the United States that was comparatively mild in climate, they met with a cold reception in South Dakota. During their 4-day stay in Sioux Falls, the mercury dropped to 15 degrees below zero. That was the coldest they had ever known, though the people there assured them it gets a great deal colder than this. You just ought to be here when it drops to 40 below. Roy and his young wife had no desire to experience such cold as that. But winter was not over for them. Tempests and snowstorms swept the prairies and the plains as their train nosed its way steadily westward. Through the snow sheds of the high Sierras, the iron horse sturdily pushed along over the gleaming iron rails. When they went over Donner Pass, a blizzard was raging. Nothing could be seen from the window but a world of swirling snow and a wind gone insane in its fury. They thought of the Donners, for whom the pass had been named, freezing and starving out there long ago during such a howling blizzard as this. Then, as the train edged southward down the western slope of the mountains, they came upon summer so suddenly that they were amazed. Instead of swirling flakes and bitter cold, their eyes were gladdened by miles and miles of orange groves, their dark varnished leaves a lovely background to the ripening golden fruit. Flowers and greenery were everywhere, and when the train stopped at the little station, they heard frogs croaking in a tiny pond nearby. Roy's father and mother had moved west some time before this, and now the four of them had a wonderful reunion. It was pleasant for mother and daughter-in-law to be able to exchange little shortcuts in housekeeping and favorite recipes. Mother Cottrell also gave Myrtie some treasures from her household, and Myrtie was glad to become more intimately an integral part of the Cottrell family. A bright spot in their waiting time in California was a visit with Ellen G. White at Elms Haven, her quiet home near the St. Helena Sanitarium. She was getting older, but her mind was still bright and alert, and she was interested in all of the broadening aspects of the worldwide church. They visited with her in her charming upstairs living room. "So you are on your way to old China," she said in her kind, soft voice. "That is good. But has full provision been made to carry on your work in South Lancaster?" They eagerly told her of their many weeks of delay until Elder Longacre had arrived to fill the vacancy. Mrs. White seemed pleased and satisfied. "I'm always happy to see the message carried into distant lands. But while we lengthen the cords, we must also strengthen the stakes at home," she declared. At last, the never-to-be-forgotten visit with his messenger ended. Mrs. White offered a beautiful prayer for God's special protection and success to attend these young people as they were going forth to minister to the multitudes in China. From there, they took the train on to Seattle, Washington, where Roy met his old roommate and classmate, Dr. H.W. Miller, and his wife. A number of missionaries were waiting to sail on the SS Minnesota, at that time the largest passenger liner on the Pacific Ocean. The huge ship followed the Great Circle route to Japan, and on the way, the clusters of the snow-covered Aleutian Islands stood out in the sunlight. Spouting whales broke the monotony of the endless ocean. They had to get their sea legs, of course, for life on the ocean is different from life on land. If the sea's a bit rough, you're apt to become seasick or dizzy until you're accustomed to the unusual motion. After a few days, if it is smooth sailing, a sea voyage is delightful. Murty and Roy had a most pleasant time strolling on deck or engaging in various kinds of recreation with their friends. They also met in one another's cabins for prayer meeting, Sabbath school, and church services. They were filled with delight at every new thing they saw and experienced. Schools of fish, the flying fish, a whale, the fire drill, and the varied incidents of a first ocean voyage. Entering the harbor of Yokohama, Japan, was an interesting experience. Yet, underneath it all, was the feeling that they were on the other side of the world from the familiarity of America and the dear ones they loved. But as he looked at the lovely woman by his side, Roy was content. At the wharf, a missionary friend came to meet them, and they were soon whisked away into an entirely different atmosphere, the Seventh-day Adventist Mission compound. There, they could relax and eat food without being constantly on guard. There, Roy met Elder F.W. Field again, the superintendent of the Japan mission. Roy had studied Greek under his tutelage, and also under his guidance, Roy began his evangelistic work. During the 4 days stopover, they visited a number of interesting places. The cities of Tokyo and Yokohama were beehives of industry. And with so many strange sights and customs, the visitors often wished they could look in 4 different directions at once. Their eyes ached with the strain of looking. On they sailed to Kobe, where they were entertained at the Kobe Sanitarium by Dr. and Mrs. W.C. Dunscombe, who gave the visitors a genuine Oriental flavored welcome. While seated on mats, everyone ate his food with chopsticks instead of cutlery. Roy and Murty's mistakes and spills caused much amusement to the seasoned veterans of the Far East. The newcomers secretly wondered if they would ever become proficient in their use, and decided they were very well pleased with the American way of conveying food to the mouth. It was not nearly so disastrous. Their third stop was at the city of Nagasaki, later to be the tragic target of an atomic bomb. Here they were given the treat of observing the coaling of the great ocean liner. Coal barges came up on either side of the mighty ship, and men were soon busy erecting dozens of scaffolds like sturdy ladders all along the sides. On these scaffolds, one above the other, were many rows of native men and women. These Japanese, with their brawny arms and stolid, expressionless faces, literally became human elevators. Wicker baskets of coal were passed rapidly upward from one hand to the other and were emptied into the huge bunkers of the Leviathan. For about 10 hours, several hundred natives worked like beavers. The coal dust arose in such clouds that the passengers found it more pleasant to spend the day in the city sightseeing and shopping. On the map, the distance between China and Japan appears very short, but it took the SS Minnesota 30 hours to make the trip across the China Sea. The boat stopped at Wusong, the port for the city of Shanghai. Here, the missionaries were met by Elder J.N. Anderson, superintendent of the China Mission, Dr. A.C. Salmon, and W.C. Hankins. From the smiles on their faces, it was obvious that the arrival of new missionaries was a great pleasure. A 40-minute trip by river launch took the group to the Bund, which is the waterfront street of Shanghai. Here the baggage went through Chinese customs. Everything appeared increasingly strange. The language, the clothing, the slanting eyes, and the long queues of hair hanging down the men's backs. Presently the company hurried away in jinrikishas, pulled by stolid-faced coolies. Soon they reached the Evans missionary home, a big, pleasant, hotel-like structure. This was headquarters for missionaries passing through the city. The next few days were busy ones for the fledgling missionaries. Those who had been there for some time gave them lists of things they would need in their inland mission station. Roy and Murty were obliged to shop for such items as cork helmets, mosquito netting for beds and cots, and light summer clothing made of silk pongee or white duck. They were also required to pay a visit to the American consulate to secure their passport visas for travel in the interior, and were surprised to receive official Chinese names. The one chosen for Roy was Kang Sheng Day, which is translated Peaceful Influence for Virtue. Murty was to be called Kang Mei Day, or Peaceful Beautiful Virtue, a title which suited her perfectly. These names were registered at the American consulate and duly entered upon their passports. They discovered that Shanghai was a progressive, modern metropolis with wide streets, stately buildings, giant industries, extensive commerce, and fine recreation parks. These were largely the product of British, French, and American thrift and enterprise, and they made the city seem almost like home. But there was another Shanghai, the original city as it was before foreign wealth came to build this great industrial and commercial giant in all its extravagant beauty. This native section is old, small, dirty, smelly, and has narrow cobbled streets. Missionaries and religious workers who lived in the fine modern section of the city were often called parlor missionaries. Leaving bustling Shanghai behind, Roy and Murty were brought face to face with an entirely different civilization. In company with their welcoming committee, they embarked on a large river steamer for 4 days' journey up the Yangtze River. As a matter of economy, the missionaries did not travel first class, but took the much cheaper Chinese staterooms. Here, they were required to furnish their own bedding and to sleep on board slats. They were expected to eat rice and noodles with chopsticks, and worst of all, they had to breathe air heavy with opium fumes. To the newcomers, everything throbbed with an intense interest. The river was crowded with all kinds of boats. At the bow of each Chinese junk were two large eyes. These illustrated the sailor's maxim, "No have eyes, no can see." Much poverty was evident. Some sails were so full of patches that it was difficult to tell just which was the original cloth. As the big boats stopped at various river ports, beggars in large and small sampans and in round tubs would come paddling about the ship. The occupants had bags attached to long poles into which they begged the passengers to drop coins. In some places, the scenery was picturesque, with hills or mountains, here and there crowned with pagan shrines and temples. As they were starting on the trip, Dr. Salmon said to Roy, "How would you folk enjoy a little language study along the way?" "Splendid," was their reply. "The sooner we are able to talk to these people, the sooner we can really begin to work." So once or twice each day, he began to initiate the new arrivals into the mysteries of Chinese speech and its curious hieroglyphics. These people inhale their food and sing their language, the doctor remarked, and the tones are very important. If you don't sing your words with the correct tone, you might call your wife a chicken or speak of a tiger when you meant to talk about a lake. "My, how absolutely precise we shall need to be," exclaimed Murty. And Roy chimed in. No wonder the great Arthur Smith declared that the Chinese language lends itself to misunderstandings as naturally as the north wind of winter finds a crack in the door. At Hankow, which is called the Chicago of China, the missionary party transferred to a smaller boat which took them to Changsha, their destination. The city is located south of the Tongting Lake on the Siang River, a large southern tributary of the Yangtze. As the boat approached the wharf, the interested young missionaries saw a large crowd of jostling, shouting, half-dressed coolies, each carrying a stick in his hand, which they imagined was used for a club or cudgel. It looked frightening to the experienced eyes of the new arrivals, accustomed as they were to the American way of doing things. But the more seasoned missionaries reassuringly told them that this was a scene to be expected and quite peaceful. These poles were used for carrying baggage and cargo. They all disembarked from the river steamer, and their friends, who knew the language, helped them select coolies to carry their luggage. It was amazing what heavy loads these men were able to carry, each piece tied firmly to the poles, which at first appeared so frightening. They threaded their way swiftly and surely, despite the burdens, through the narrow, crowded streets to the little mission compound about a mile away. The missionaries followed closely and were given a warm welcome by the workers P.J. Laird and his wife, Dr. Emma Perrine Laird. Mr. Laird had formerly been a Church of England missionary, but some years earlier he had become convinced of the truth of the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and had joined the ranks of our missionaries in China. As Roy was introduced to Mr. Laird, he grasped his hand, exclaiming, "Well, here we are at last. We have come nearly 10,000 miles to join you in labor." "And we have waited for you these many months," was Mr. Laird's quiet reply. "Now, our dreams are fulfilled." Dr. Emma threw her arms around Myrtie, the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Now at last, I shall have help in my work for the Chinese women," she cried. Roy thought back over the many anxious months since they had received their call, dismantling their home, parting with little keepsakes, the enforced delay, then the actual departure, and the heartbreaking farewells with loved ones and friends. Yet, it was worth it all, he realized. The best way to spend a life is in service. Real service for Christ and the good of mankind. Myrtie was glad to be able to drink boiled water without fear and eat food without hidden suspicion as to how it was prepared. There were plans to make, conditions to talk over, dreams to be aired, and needs that were pressing. How their voices did chatter. The dingy little compound on a busy street was surrounded by a wall 30 feet high, but it was only about 35 by 75 feet in size, and was woefully inadequate to provide for chapel, schoolroom, and living quarters for 2 families. Yet, there was nothing to do for the present but to make the best of things as they were. The mission work was comparatively new in Changsha. There were a few believers, but none had as yet been baptized. The first Sabbath was a day of blessing never to be forgotten. In the afternoon, all the missionaries went for a walk on top of the old city wall. It made Roy and Myrtie think of pictures they had seen of the medieval castles built during the Middle Ages. The walls surrounding the city were nearly 7 miles in circumference. They averaged about 40 feet in height and were 30 feet wide at the top. Old cannons were mounted at regular intervals along the walls. On examination, it was evident that they had been purchased from the United States, and that some of them had been used in our country nearly 100 years before, in the War of 1812. The high walls attested to the lawless atmosphere of inland China. Robber barons, many of them having their strongholds in the mountains, lived on the products of their numerous forays. Hence, walls were necessary for survival. Myrtie's quick eye observed one small bit of loveliness. From under the base of one cannon, a beautiful little flower was peeping out. It looked incongruous on a high, formidable wall underneath an instrument of death. The new arrivals were deeply impressed. "Surely," Roy said, "God was here before we came." And they thought of the words of the psalmist, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me." Psalms 139, verses 9 and 10. The end of chapter 10. Chapter 11. Pioneer Experiences in China. When Roy and his wife landed at Changsha in Hunan province on the morning of April 8, 1908, it was with the somber realization that they were indeed pioneer missionaries in every sense of the word. Only 8 years had elapsed since the tragic Boxer uprising, when so many missionaries and Chinese Christians had been massacred by the demon-like Boxers, and proud and haughty Changsha had prided itself in being the most anti-foreign city of the whole empire. Nevertheless, their faith in God's protective power was strong and their courage high. they forgot their fears and set up their own housekeeping. They hired the all-important language teacher and a houseboy or cook. The houseboy was totally ignorant of the foreigner's language or peculiar habits and had to receive his instructions by the dubious method of sign language. Murty was determined that he master a few basic rules, such as not failing to boil all water, fruits, and vegetables before serving. At times, her patience and long suffering with her number one houseboy gave way to exasperation. He might better have been called number one dumb boy. In the typical Oriental fashion, he was politeness itself and endeavored to please his master and mistress. But through misunderstanding, he sometimes appeared to be incredibly stupid. One afternoon, Murty arrived home with a few purchases, very pleased with herself for having found some small new potatoes. It had been a long time since they'd even seen potatoes. What a feast they would have at dinner. Delivering them over to the cook, she carefully pantomimed with appropriate gestures just how she wanted them prepared, and then went upstairs to work on her language study. It was hard to concentrate on those elusive characters while she was thinking about those mouth-watering potatoes. When the dinner gong finally sounded, she hurried down to the table to find Roy staring at the center dish. "Anything the matter, dear?" she asked, slightly alarmed. "I don't know for sure," he replied, still looking. "What do you call that stuff, anyway?" He pointed to the offending dish. "I thought I'd sampled just about every kind of Chinese rarity, but this is the strangest I've ever seen." After such a speech, Murty was almost afraid to examine it more closely, realizing all too well what had happened to some of her favorite recipes served a la Chinese. But when she braced herself for real inspection, she had to laugh in spite of her disappointment. There, on the plate, hacked apart with a hammer and neatly arranged in a circle, lay the jagged hunks of raw, unwashed potatoes. Number one houseboy had achieved mashed potatoes, at least. Studying with their language teacher, however, was much more agreeable and successfully performed. Although the teacher knew not a word of English, he was clever enough at teaching writing and speech, so that soon the newcomers were able to make their own purchases at the market easily. One morning, as they sat with the teacher, struggling with the strange new vocabulary, repeating Fangzi, Dojizi, Idizi, Deodizi, Izadizi, house, table, chair, knife, fork, Mr. Laird came running to their study nook quite out of breath. "Friends," he exclaimed, holding high a letter, "here is a notice from the provincial governor." Of course, he had their attention immediately. A letter from the governor himself. "Well, Mr. Laird, what does he have to say? Don't keep us in suspense," Roy exclaimed. "Listen to this," and he began to translate aloud. "His Highness, the Governor of Hunan Province, announces the annual celebration of the Dragon Festival to be held in Changsha on the 8th, 9th, and 10th days of this month. During this time, we caution all foreign residents to remain off the streets and to refrain from taking any photographs of the processions or dragon boat races. If all foreigners remain in their homes, there will be peace in the city." Roy was perplexed. A dragon festival sounds like something thrilling. We could have a holiday and get a first-hand look at these people and some of their customs. Why does the governor insist we stay indoors and miss all the excitement? He demanded of Mr. Laird. The governor knows what he's doing, and it's only for our protection. At last year's festival, he explained, one of the visiting missionaries tried to take some pictures. The crowd smashed his camera and caused a near riot. Phew! He really had a narrow escape. Myrtie looked at her husband, and he looked at her. Well, dear, I have been told that the great procession goes right past our door. So we'll get our holiday and see the parade anyway, he promised her. Only, we'll see it from behind the lattice windows inside the compound. There's no use of taking foolish risks, Myrtie replied cautiously. Perhaps if they had been adequately informed of the nature of the big pagan celebration, the newcomers would not have been so anxious to watch it after all. But they were not aware of what was to come. And when the hour arrived, their eyes were glued expectantly on the crowds thronging the streets in front of the compound. The procession took 3 hours to pass. Many business firms and merchants' guilds participated. Idols, large and small, from numerous temples and shrines, were carried along the way. Then came the main feature. A huge yellow dragon, half a block long, carried on the shoulders of 128 sweating, panting coolies. This was followed by a company of 50 priests, each carrying a pot of smoking incense suspended by a cord from a rusty needle pierced through the right wrist. Their grim, contorted faces gave silent evidence of the torture they were enduring. What they suffered for a wooden idol shocked and amazed the Cottrells. But the most appalling sight was yet to come. Toward the end of the parade, the missionaries' horrified eyes beheld 2 small children, possibly 2 years of age, bound securely to a long pole by an arm and a leg. Mrs. Laird and Myrtie gasped and turned away, overcome by nausea at the wretched sight. Obviously, some parents had been willing to make costly sacrifices to the demon gods by presenting their innocent babies without even thinking of their horrible suffering. But in the terrific heat of that summer day, the poor little things couldn't survive for long. Before they passed the mission gate, life had vanished, and their little heads bobbed up and down upon lifeless breasts. Finally, the menfolk could stand it no longer and shuttered the windows. How unspeakably terrible paganism is, Roy moaned, horrified. Soon thereafter, the Cottrells and the Lairds began an intensive search for a more suitable compound. But such a place was not easy to find. With the prevailing extreme sentiment against the foreign devils, as they were commonly called, few Chinese would assume the risk of renting their property to Christian missionaries. The agonizing heat of a Chinese summer had arrived in full force. At night they sometimes sought to snatch elusive sleep by wrapping themselves in wet sheets. Most of the foreigners had already forsaken the city heat and fled to the mountains. At length, Roy and Myrtie gave in and followed suit. Arrangements were made for a little cottage on Gi Gung San, Chicken Comb Mountain, and with a sigh of relief they started on their vacation. When they reached Hankow by steamer, they were chagrined to discover that destructive floods had washed out several railroad bridges. No one was certain when the service would be restored, and there they were, stranded. After wandering about in several blind alleys, they finally came to the home of some European missionaries of another denomination. On first sight, they were cordially received, but when Roy mentioned the mission to which they belonged, the superintendent refused to admit them. Sometime after this, the man related the incident to an Episcopalian friend, saying, "When I heard they were Seventh-day Adventists, I dropped them like a hot potato." "You did?" exclaimed the other in a shocked voice. "I'm ashamed of you. Mr. and Mrs. Cottrell are among my good friends. Why, you would even treat the heathen better than that." Alone and friendless in Hankow, Roy sent a telegram to the mission office in Shanghai and received an immediate invitation to spend the summer at Mo Gang San, Bamboo Mountain. This was a lovely resort not far from Shanghai, and the grateful couple eagerly accepted. Their language teacher, a tall, black-haired Confucianist, had accompanied them as an indispensable part of their baggage. One morning, as they were having worship, they were amazed to hear Huang Han Ren, beautiful glittering yellow, join them in an audible prayer. They were greatly encouraged and found him an eager student of the gospel message. A few months later, when he was baptized, he changed his name to Huang Dezen Deo, meaning Honorable Doctrine Yellow. Eventually, he became the first ordained Seventh-day Adventist minister in South Central China. Roy and Myrtie immensely enjoyed the relaxation they found on that mountaintop retreat. With the coming of fall, they reluctantly returned with the others to a meeting of the mission committee in Shanghai. 4 of the families occupied a 4-story house, each on a different floor. One night, as the Cottrells prepared to retire in their suite of rooms on the 3rd level, Myrtie tucked away her purse in a bureau drawer. Later, thinking better of her action, she hid it under her pillow for safekeeping. In the morning, she had good reason to be thankful for this decision. The drawer had been turned upside down, and the contents were scattered about, but her handbag was safe, of course. Another missionary, however, had not been so fortunate. Elder J.N. Anderson, superintendent of the China mission, who had been sleeping in a room on the same floor, couldn't find his trousers when he awakened. He anxiously inquired of a fellow missionary if he was wearing his pants by mistake, and he was not at all amused when the accusation was laughingly denied. Then he happened to glance out of the window, and there they were, draped over the back fence. His wallet, however, was nowhere to be found. When the entire household met at breakfast and compared notes, they discovered that the thief had searched every floor of the building and had escaped without awakening a soul. They were glad that their loss was not greater. Dr. and Mrs. Selman were ready to leave for America on furlough, and Roy and Myrtie were called to replace them at the Duzhu Gyeku Mission in Honan Province. At last their goods were transferred, and upon their arrival, the missionaries resumed their language study once more, this time with a Mohammedan teacher who frequently brought along his pet bird to entertain his pupils. Things were humming along in fine order at the mission station, when suddenly, in the middle of a March night, Myrtie was stricken with severe abdominal pains. Roy applied hot and cold fomentations without results. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he aroused other members of the mission family. At 6 a.m., they sent a telegram for help to the nearest physician, a Presbyterian stationed 150 miles away. 12 hours later, they received his reply. He was unable to come. Since Myrtie showed absolutely no improvement, Roy improvised a stretcher, employed carrier coolies, and at 9 o'clock that night set out with Murty for the railroad station 40 miles distant. As carefully as they could, the coolies bore their delicate burden over the rough terrain in the black night in their race with death. Again and again the pain became so intense that Murty cried out for the men to stop and let her rest. Each time they halted in their journey, Roy would kneel by the stretcher and stroke her fevered brow. Many times the sufferer clenched her teeth in agony and pleaded, "Let me die right here. But tell our friends in America, Roy, that I didn't die because of any tropical diseases of the country." Her husband would hold her hand, speak a word of cheer, and offer a brief prayer. Then he would give her another whiff of chloroform and order the coolies to proceed. Their guardian angel must have seen to it that the train didn't pull out of the station until the Cottrells were safely aboard. After stretching his weary patient full length upon the seat and seeing to her comfort, Roy slumped down across the aisle, and overcome by hours of strain and wakefulness, was soon dozing. About sunset, however, both were awakened by a sharp jolt. Roy learned that the train was stopping for the night, only 20 miles from the Lutheran hospital. He hurried across the platform to speak to the station agent. "Please, sir, can't the train go on just 20 miles further?" he implored. "My wife is a very sick woman, and I must get her to the doctor without delay." The agent merely shook his head and explained that the railroad had its rules, and rules are rules. "But," pleaded Roy, greatly agitated, "this is strictly a matter of life or death. She must get to that hospital right away." Another shake of his head was his only answer. Arguing was apparently useless. He would have to try another angle. "Well, how much would it cost for the engine and one car to take us the rest of the way?" I think, sir, that $100 would do it," he mused, stroking his long beard. $100, Roy repeated slowly to himself. "Very well. Here is the money." And he proceeded to count it out. "But I'm afraid I must first receive orders from Peking," the agent protested when he saw that Roy was in earnest. He sent telegram after telegram, but could not obtain permission. At 11 o'clock, he gave up the attempt with a shrug of his shoulders and a feeble attempt to appear sorry. Roy tramped dispiritedly back to the car to find Murty now sleeping peacefully. Thankfully, he settled himself down across the aisle to wait out the night. Only then did he recall that it was Friday evening, the first and only time of his busy life that the Sabbath hours had come upon him unawares. Morning dawned on the bleak plains of central China, and by 9 o'clock, Murty was reposing in the comfortable bed at the Lutheran hospital with the kindly Norwegian doctor and his sympathetic little staff ministering to her needs. Her condition was diagnosed as appendicitis. Since the acute stage was apparently past, the doctor recommended that as soon as possible the Cottrells should go on to Shanghai, where there were medical specialists and better facilities for surgery. They remained 16 days in this congenial place while Murty recuperated and gained enough strength for the journey. Ever after, they have remembered with deepest gratitude these kindly, devoted people. After an uneventful trip to Hankow and a cruise down the Yangtze on a German boat, Murty entered the Victoria Nursing Home in Shanghai for successful surgery. It was summertime once again, and the Cottrells were back on Mogang San. One morning, while Murty was still in her bedroom, Roy looked up from the veranda in time to see a disheveled man rushing straight towards the house, gesturing wildly. In great haste, Roy ran inside, hurriedly bolted all the doors and windows, and looked around for a means of defense. As the frenzied man was beating violently at the front door, Murty, looking out a side window, caught sight of one of the mounted police, the first they had seen since their arrival at the resort. Quickly, Roy opened his window and shouted for help. The officer came on the run. Seeing that he was pursued, the cowardly intruder retreated into the woods. Hearing the shouts, others followed, and with their assistance, the policeman soon had the culprit cornered. "So is you in trouble again," his words were quiet yet firm. "You've been locked up enough times already. And if you don't want me to haul you in again, get off this mountain immediately. Don't let us ever see you here again." Knowing the officer meant business, the wild man disappeared at once, and they all breathed a sigh of relief when he was out of sight. Surprised by the policeman's calm and gentle attitude, Roy turned to him and asked, "Are you a Christian?" "No," came the quick reply. "But have you ever heard of Jesus?" "Yes, but I don't really know who he is." So seated on the doorstep, the pagan police officer heard the marvelous story of creation, the fall of man, and the Savior who came to rescue a helpless world. More than an hour passed when Ru Sifu arose to leave. "This story is truly wonderful," he exclaimed, putting on his cap. "May I come again to hear more about the Christian religion?" Naturally, he was warmly invited to return, and during the next 2 months, he was a frequent visitor at the mission cottage. He loved the gospel message, and when the Cottrell's vacation days were at an end, he severed his connection with the police department and accompanied them to Shanghai. There, he was employed at the Seventh-day Adventist Mission Press, where he quickly won the esteem and admiration of all his associates. 1 year later, this fine young convert became extremely ill, and despite all the medical help and loving ministration, he passed away. Roy and 2 of the other missionaries fashioned a coffin, and their wives lined and covered it in a little bamboo grove on a corner of the mission property. This devoted Chinese Christian, Ru Sifu, awaits the call of the life giver. It was a sad, yet heart-stirring occasion for Roy and Myrtie. Only 12 months earlier, in their hour of danger, this kindly man had suddenly appeared like an angel of deliverance, and through this experience, he had found himself the greater deliverance from sin. The end of chapter 11 of Pioneers Together.